Hello and welcome to Oasis XP. Thank you for joining our faculty-focused network on innovation, one already set to become, based on current enrollment, the largest gathering of independent school teachers nationally, in the thousands. Our broadcast today is on blending AP Humanities classes. But before I introduce our guest, a quick word on your opportunities to participate. We designed Oasis XP so that independent school faculty can conveniently network themselves into national exposure on innovation. Please ask your questions through the chat box. I receive those questions and pose them to our guest. The 9 innovation listservs that go with Oasis XP provide an opportunity for our guests to answer those questions that we did not have time for today. So check the listservs in the coming days for further dialogue. If you're seeing this as a recording, we have designed the sessions to conveniently fit into a typical 45-minute class period during your prep times. These recordings are perfect for departmental dialogue and even full faculty presentations. Enjoy. So first, a warm welcome to Debbie Ayers, Assistant High School Principal at Flint Hill School in Virginia.
Thank you very much. Glad to be here.
Great, great. Debbie, you've been a part of the Oasis Network for some time, attended many conferences. So perhaps you could just start by telling us a little bit about Flint Hill School.
Certainly. Flint Hill School is a K-12 institution in Northern Virginia, Oakton, Virginia. We are serving a wide population of students that are new to independent schools. Some come from our very large public school system in Fairfax County. We have a large contingency of international students. And we have some students who have been in non-traditional educational programs before arriving at our campus. We're a one-to-one laptop school. All of our students use MacBook devices, and we have those issued at the beginning of the year. And one of the reasons I have been keenly interested in finding good, solid ways to pedagogically integrate technology into our program is because one-to-one for us has not meant just having a device for word processing, for storage of documents, but to really transform the way we are educating our students. And so blended learning has been a format that worked for me, and I've been very excited about it for previous years, and loved the message that I received from many fellow colleagues at Oasis events on how to do that effectively.
Brilliant, brilliant. So how many years have you been teaching, and tell us a little bit about your journey as a teacher?
Sure. I've been teaching since the mid-1980s. I began as a history teacher in the public schools. I've also taken a couple of years to homeschool my children. I was formerly a military spouse. My husband has since retired, but we've been all over the country. So I've taught in a variety of school systems, both public and private, and have landed at Flint Hill in his retirement years in order to sort of plant my roots here. I came into Flint Hill as a learning specialist, worked with students in the humanities to support the classroom teachers, and then began my journey again as a classroom teacher, moving back into the classroom for European history and contemporary world history, and from there into being a class dean for our 9th graders. And at that time, that's when we became a one-to-one laptop school, and so I became very interested in how we were going to utilize that wonderful resource that we were blessed with in an effective way, and continued innovating and trying new approaches, and worked closely with teachers in a team atmosphere, and have moved into administration now. Still, as an academic dean as well, I'm continuing to work very closely with teachers on how they implement technology into the classroom.
Fantastic. So, Debbie, I'm going to pass you over the presenter role. I think you might have it now. And can we take a look at your screen just to see what it looks like?
Sure.
Perfect. I'm going to hand it over to you, and perhaps you could just take us through the presentation.
All right.
And then we'll have some questions at the end, and apologize if I intervene and ask you something during the course of the presentation.
That's fine. How does my screen look at this point?
It's fine. Perfect.
Okay, great. So I'm going to walk you through, hopefully not too rapidly, but I want to give you an idea of how I ventured into blended learning, and as an AP teacher, how that has worked at our school.
Great.
All right. So first of all, reasons why I implemented blended learning into my classroom is I was looking for something that would set the classroom apart from a non-traditional, from a traditional, I'm sorry, traditional classroom for AP learning. It was a bit of a tough sell at first with my administrators at the time because blending an AP classroom at first glance looks like how in the world would you not want to be with those students all of the available class time in order to get through the content. Our school year begins in September, doesn't end until the middle of June, and with AP exams coming up early in May, it seemed to be kind of a shot in the foot that I wasn't going to be able to finish everything. So looking to
Cutting out a little bit, Debbie. That's okay. I think you need to move a little bit closer.
Okay, how is this?
That's fine. That's perfect.
Okay, great. Differentiating lessons, making sure that my products were going to be high quality when they were student driven was a challenge in the first year. I ended up tweaking a lot of things after the first year to make it run more smoothly, more efficient. I found that with my particular group of students who, by the way, were sophomores, many of them it was their first experience with an AP class, that I needed to provide a lot of structure in the first quarter, the first 9 weeks, and then as the year progressed, I could step back more and more to put my students at the center of the learning rather than me guiding every step of the instruction. So time to do that in the first year and actually in subsequent years, because with younger students in an AP program, you have to build those skills. So blending isn't something that just one day I found that I could come in and do. It was something that we had to learn together. But overall, I would say the students loved it and outcomes were great for both of us.
Great.
As a one-to-one school, we needed to have a philosophy to sort of structure the way we were, what our goals were for implementing the computers into the classroom. So Dr. Ruben Puntadura, who was an early, I guess, a guru of educational technology in around 2007, 2008, has a program that many may be aware of now. It's called the SAMR model, where you are taking technology into the classroom, but you have a goal of redefining the instruction that you're providing. So not just as a form of using a computer to open up Google Docs and have your students write in a different format that way. It's actually using the technology to change those lessons so the outcome for the learner is much richer, much greater, and hopefully inspires lifelong learning. That's the goal. So in this model on the screen, you can see that the goal for an AP classroom, and I would argue any classroom, is to lean towards student-centered education and work on modifying lessons with an ultimate goal of redefining your lessons so they are better for the learner. Some considerations, and pardon the alliteration here, but it helps me remember what I'm after when I'm thinking about teaching a teacher about blended learning. And these are the considerations that most of you will have as you begin. It's also the considerations that your school, your administrators will have. How are you going to check for attendance or maintain good attendance records when perhaps half of your classes are going to be blended and students will be in a different environment, whether they're at school using a device or at home using a device? How do you account for that time on task that you're not physically present with them? How are you going to monitor the agency? Are they actually assuming responsibility for their work? How can you ensure that there's integrity in the products that they're giving you? How do you observe the assessments on the days that you may not be with them physically, but they are working on assignments? And then what is the ultimate achievement? What's the added value of conducting your classes this way? Mm-hmm. So just very quickly, I won't read all of the bullet points, but I've added in blue at the top of each of these slides that although there are concerns, there are outcomes that I would say in my first year were unintended outcomes, but I was elated to see that this is what happened, that attendance certainly I needed to come up with systems for how to track and to monitor and to provide a safe environment for students if they weren't actually in the brick and mortar classroom. But the participation just skyrocketed, especially with my more reluctant learners. They wanted to achieve, they wanted to participate because they had some choice in what they were doing. So we had check-in points in assigned classrooms early in the year, but later on we relied on electronic check-ins, a more synchronous atmosphere for learning, and then by the end of the year I was able to turn loose a little bit more, and I would have collaborative groups meeting at different parts of the school, or some of them actually chose to meet in study groups off campus on weekends. They would work on projects together at each other's homes or in other places that they chose.
So Debbie, just to intervene for a second, if you could go back to that, were you monitoring the utilization of some of the electronic documents that you had given them, you know, videos or flipped work, and any other kinds of ways of testing how engaged they were?
Yes, all of the above. It's a framework that grew a little bit each quarter. In the first quarter, I actually had them in the classroom, but I was not leading the class. They had a task or a group assignment or a research quest, and I was there, but I was actually not engaging with them. But I was watching their screens. Many of them had shared Google Docs, or we would use a platform like Padlet, where they were producing and posting to the same place, and they could watch what all of the groups were doing. So that was one way for me to monitor in the early days. Later on, they would need to be checked in, and they would have a work deliverable by the end of the 2-hour period or an hour period, so I could see that work in progress was being delivered on time. Even if it wasn't finished, I could judge the progress of it, and then I could submit it back. We use Google Classroom as well at our school, so when something's submitted, I can see the progress, and then I can resubmit it to the student for more work. So that was another way for me to keep track. But yes, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Finish what you're saying.
I was just going to say that there were lots of benefits to not having things need to come in at the end of a certain hour. For many of our students who have extended time, that gave them a very comfortable pacing opportunity to where they didn't feel they were against the clock. So we might have a deliverable that would need to come in 48 hours. But still allowing for me to interact with them. We used email to an extent. I still had office hours after school if they wanted to access me that way. And then when I blended, it was one day blended, the next day in class, and so there wasn't a lot of time that passed before I actually laid eyes on their work and face-to-face with them.
Got it.
So it was...
So if you look at the trajectory of a typical non-blended AP class over the course of a year, there's how would you compare the participation in a non-blended class with a blended class like this, particularly, you know, as the class progresses and you get towards that crescendo of the AP exams and having to review everything and all those kinds of considerations?
That's where I felt that the work was heaviest on me. I needed to front-end load a lot. So I spent the first year I was barely keeping up with myself, but by the second year I could go back through my lessons and judge which ones have been most successful and go ahead and preload them into my course page. And so students could see what was coming up. And that served as a bit of a motivator, but I think in a larger way, just having them be able to collaborate in their own time kept them motivated. I can't quite quantify this, but I found that once I stepped back from giving them every assignment every day, standing before them and delivering a lecture, the boredom seemed to go down. It's kind of hard to say I was boring them, but I think history had so much content in European history, that was the AP that I taught, that I was falling into that mold. But once I stepped back and they had to own more of that process, there was far more engagement. It actually surprised me. And so assignments were more likely to come in on time. When we did project presentations, everybody was participating. I mean, it was really amazing to see how much more they picked up when they realized we were only going to be together a couple of times in our rotation. We rotate 6 days, and so you meet with students 4 out of those 6 days. I was actually only meeting with them twice, and they were on their own for the other 2 days. So there was an urgency to the agency, I guess.
Excellent. Excellent.
So the next page, again, the agency. It increased the enthusiasm, just as I was saying. I could continue to differentiate for students that needed opportunities to show their learning in a different format. The pacing could be varied. Everything that was unique to blending, that it meets students where they are in their time and their spaces. It was wonderful to be able to see them thrive when the learning was more at their discretion. Academic honor and integrity. We have an honor code at our school. All students sign it on the first day of classes, and we have an honor council that adjudicates any suspected violations that are brought forward by teachers or faculty or other faculty. So I had to be very deliberate and intentional about talking to them as far as how to cite sources, when to attribute. That paraphrasing and summarizing did require attribution. So those lessons were held at the beginning of the year, and I had an assessment of those to make sure everybody was clear on that. So when they turned in work that had been produced from their own internet research, that they were doing that with integrity. And I found that to be a very good college preparatory skill for them. Students who have come back years later have said that that's how things are operating in their college world too, and that they appreciated the experience so early on.
Sure.
Assessments and reflection, we were able to mimic the way instruction had been delivered. So I could use more online assessments. With assessments, I would request reflections from the students. What did you do to prepare for this? How difficult did you find this lesson based on your research skills? What could we have done differently? What could I have steered you toward? So a lot of reflection came on top of the assessments, which I know as we work with teachers on being more effective in assessments, the piece that we want to see more frequently is the reflection. What did you learn about the way you learn? That metacognitive piece really came into play as we worked through this blended system.
And you put up there collaborative formative assessments. Mm-hmm. Are those the same assessments that you did in a typical non-blended class, or different?
No, they were different. It was actually a lot of fun too. So when I needed to do a checkup in the middle of a unit, a quiz, if you will, I would distribute a set of maybe 5 to 10 questions. I would give it to the class as a whole, and I would walk out of the room. And at that point, they would come up with the answers to their quiz, collaborating as I wanted them to do in the blended lesson planning. And then I would come back into the room, and I would ask or draw a number or whatever. I would take one of their papers. And that's the paper we would grade as a class, and then everybody accepted that final grade. And so they were forced to collaborate. They couldn't choose who was going to give me the quiz, but that collaborative, formative work was really great. And I think it did serve to make their summative work a higher level as well. But they enjoyed quizzes. No one dreaded the quizzes because the stress was away. They were working on it together, and I think that too is a 21st century skill. Coming up with the best product by using the expertise of everyone in the room seems to make sense.
Peer review, basically.
Yeah.
And the person no one knew whose assessment it was.
Correct.
Just a number. Fantastic. Thank you.
Achievement and motivation. And oftentimes students plan their world around the AP exam in May, and as teachers, you know, we sort of dread that type of mentality and that orientation just to that one day when you've probably spent weeks and weeks and months with them. To have it all end up with just that one day seemed to be a a bit of a downer. So the achievement after blending was really that their motivation to be learners, to be more accomplished researchers, and ultimately what I thought was great about teaching an AP course that way is they became historians. They understood what is the work that a historian does in order to advance or to add to the body of knowledge. And that truly is what AP history should be about. And if their score earned them the right to opt out of a semester or 2 semesters of a class in college, then that might have been the icing on the cake. But I like to believe that at the end of the year that the students were just motivated to continue taking history, to not dread it, to not be intimidated by the research, and they had become historians.
So all the same, you know, we live in a hothouse independent school world that focuses on AP schools, etc. And I imagine that a AP history teacher that hasn't blended their classes is going to be worried about their scores. What was it like in the first year, and you know, how did the parent body react to whatever the outcome was?
Now, that's a great question. The parents were a little bit skeptical, but I think one of the advantages that I had was years of experience, and I believe had I been a much younger teacher, there might have been more pushback, but they were willing to give me a little more leeway with this, so they did trust me. Some students who struggle more with executive functioning and planning needed to have a little more guidance and structure. Many of our Learning Center specialists were also partnering with me to support students who may need just a little more structure before they're turned loose in the building to complete something on their own. But all in all, the parents were supportive, and the test scores in the first year really stayed about the same. But the second year, I had more students who had told students and who had told students, and so enrollment, I would say the access to this AP course increased, and the scores began to go up. And then the third year, the scores were about the best I had seen in this class. It is a hard class for sophomores. There are schools that wait till senior year to do European history. Yeah. And we did have better scores by that third year.
Yeah, I mean, it's a very content-intensive, heavyweight course. Mm-hmm. Well, as we're talking about that, you know, another question that occurred to me is, did you change the scope of what you covered in the AP curriculum as a result of this, or did you leave it the same?
I really left it the same, but instead of using such heavy content-driven study guides, which I had done before, I would prepare a huge number of questions and vocabulary terms for them to identify. I left the vocabulary and terminology intact, but we transformed the amount of time each person would spend answering or identifying words, and it became a collaborative effort. So we would open up one large Google Doc, and each student might take 2 or 3 words, but they would develop those words using images and resources and linking to websites. So what they mass produced was this wonderful study guide for the whole group, and that afforded us more time to do deep dive exercises and to compare sources. So the work of a historian should never rely on one source. I wanted them to always use 2 or 3 sources, so if they weren't spending all of their time identifying words and answering questions as they were reading, which, you know, most of them would say that's not all that interesting, we were doing more fun things together and could very quickly produce our study guides when we shared the work.
Right. And Debbie, you know, as you said, a sophomore class is a difficult one because, you know, I don't know what the enrollment of your kids are like, you know, academically, but in my experience anyway, as a high school principal, there is a big jump between 9th and 10th, and some people don't make it in terms of maturity. Can you talk a little bit about the kinds of student maturity levels that benefited and didn't benefit from this over the years?
Well, I should back up just a moment and let your viewers know.
And so, sorry, just to add, I'm speaking partly from a motivational point of view, since we're on that slide, but also just from an organizational point of view, too.
Okay. Our ninth grade program was European history. So all ninth graders at least were developing a foundation in the content. So at the end of the year, teachers give a recommendation as to who should go to honors or to AP. And so this would be a bit of a select group. They are not differentiated based on motivation levels or whether or not they receive support in our learning center or for any other learning differences. But they are selected because they have a keen interest in history. So I will say there's some natural or organic motivation already there for this course. To do blending at an AP level with sophomores, I'm not sure where else I could do this and have as much success, because you have to have the understanding that this is going to be a harder course and be willing at the get-go that this is going to be a little bit of a stretch for you, regardless of how strong you were in the ninth grade class. So motivationally, I felt like I had that from the students. But trying to now develop the academic maturity to do part of this without the teacher holding your hand so much was still growth for that population too.
Got it.
Does that answer your question?
Yeah. Yes,
okay.
thank you.
Okay. So workflow, the basic structure of this program for me started out at the beginning of the year. I tried to blend 25% of our meeting times. So in a rotation, we meet 4 times. I started off by having them do their blended day. That's what we called it. It was the day that I wasn't giving them direct instruction for 25% or 1 day. The second semester, we went up to the 50% mark, but still in the classroom, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. And then in the second semester, we were separated. We were in different places. They had the freedom to choose their workspace. We have a learning commons. We have plenty of other spaces in our building where they could work, or if they were choosing to do this outside of the 8 to 3 time frame, they could do that as well. But ideally, we wanted to consider this blending to get to the 50% mark, where they were 50% direct with the teacher and 50% on their own. So this is just sort of an ideal of how this would work. The first class day, I'm introducing topics, providing some key vocabulary, maybe doing a what do you already know, what are we going to know, and the vehicles that we're going to use to get to that target point. So that would be day 1 together. Day 2, a blended day where there's a web quest or a key activity that helps break apart some of the concepts and begin to connect to what we previously did and to look forward to what the expectations are at the end of the unit. The next in-class day would be coming back together, looking at what we learned, measuring it against a rubric, or maybe at that point creating a rubric as a class for how we will measure learning at the end of the unit again. Day 4, we're continuing some of the work, the independent projects or the collaborative projects. If you're working on a collaborative project, chances are the group will have to report back to the whole group. And so there was opportunity there to talk to them about tasks and roles in a group, who is going to moderate, who's going to research, who's going to collate, who's going to attribute the sources, to me to give them some of that guidance. And then
go on. No, finish.
Yeah, I was just going to say, and then the last day would be an assessment day, group discussion day, time for reflection. Sometimes this would take 2 days, especially if we were using a period to do an essay, which I wanted to do. Essays would take up the class period, and then we would have the next day to review.
So just looking at this, Debbie, how much of this was new stuff that you had to create before you embarked on this? The web quests, were they just transformations of previous assessments and the other stuff? I mean, well, how much of this had, in terms, if you were to put a percentage on it, right, roughly, what would the answer to be to that question?
I would say at least half, and the reason being is I typically do not create new multiple choice questions. I use databases of questions that have either been recycled from other teachers or from the AP released exams, and those are the questions. And we also used a study guide, a purchase study guide for the students. So I'm not creating that sort of material that students might be working with. But if there's a topic that is frequently part of an essay question on an AP exam, or based on listservs that I belong to, or chat groups with other AP teachers, that's what I would build the web quest around. So a common theme or a content area that needs to be covered really well, and then I would develop a web quest on that. But the wonderful and helpful thing about that is there's so much available to teachers who teach AP right now. There's so many sources that have been digitized, and it just doesn't take long to pull some of that together. So I would probably continue to tweak them over the summer, but the web quest, I created all of them. But once you do one or two, you can recycle it the next year, just tweak it. So again, as 2- and 3-year points came along, I was collecting quite a bit of resources for myself. It's hard in the first year.
And what about the amount of asynchronous content that you actually recorded yourself that was new? Could you talk a little bit about that?
Quite a bit. The asynchronous content, well, no, I'll take that back. Students had opportunities to draw from those vocabulary words and could go off on their own with those. Ideally, they're not repeating each other. So I might present the group with 15, 20 content area terms, big themes, and then they could venture off into those areas on their own. So I'm not really creating what they're doing with it, but I'm giving them guidelines that you need to come back and be able to present to the group a who, what, where, when, and why this is important. And also, I would like for you to connect it to something else that's being done with your peers. And so that's not me creating material, but that is at least giving them some sort of framework. Here's a topic, and I want you to go to it in this format. What sources you use are up to you, and how you present it. If you want to do a flyer, if you want to do a lecture, if you want to do an iBook, a PowerPoint, those can be your choices, and give you time in class to present. So that does cut back on my teacher work, but I just have to make sure that they're not going too far off the reservation on that.
Got it. Got it. Perfect. Keep going.
Okay. And then lastly, you know, I really do believe that in the 21st century, our students, preparing them for the workforce, preparing them for college, isn't about the entry. It's not about the getting into college or getting a job. It's the success that I want them to enjoy once they're there. I know that these students have the ability to go far, and so I want to make sure that I'm promoting that idea of success in college, success in your chosen career field. So this blended program sort of lets me share with them that I have confidence in you, that I can embrace your knowledge, I can embrace your ability to make some of these learning decisions on your own. And to me, that's why this works. This is why this is a good format for the classroom, and especially for AP instruction.
Fantastic. Well, thank you for that. And here we have our first question. So you have done this within a traditional schedule. Do you think that change in the school schedule would enhance your strategy?
I do. I believe that a school schedule that could be a little more open to perhaps a student doing this with multiple courses might be easier. For mine, I was the only one who was blending, especially in the first couple of years. And so it was quite contrary to what others were doing. And so students, it was confusing to their schedule sometimes, you know, showing up at the wrong time or showing up on a day that was blended. So I do believe that if we had the openness to blend multiple courses, or even have students have the choice of everything being blended, that would be quite extraordinary.
Right. And what? How long? What about class period length? Would that factor into the equation?
I honestly think an hour and a half would be ideal. Our course, we're slated for an hour. It did not always seem like enough time, especially when you're prepping for an essay and you want to give the full hour for it and then have time to either submit it in a certain format or go print it if the students prefer to do that. So an hour and a half would be great, but an hour was doable. An hour was doable. That's what we have.
Okay. Here's another one. How has this changed you as a teacher?
I don't want to be using cliches, but it changes you from being a sage on the stage to someone who's more of a facilitator. It feels right. It feels, I connect better with my students. It does foster deeper relationships, and you're able to go around the classroom, move around more, the students move around more. It's a laboratory. Laboratories that we might have thought just belong on the science wing belong in the history wing as well, and it's just exciting. I have to say that as someone who likes to plan out almost every hour of my day, I had to turn loose of that mindset and let there be far more flexibility. And I think that's a better way to address teenagers anyway, that they come to the classroom with their own life struggles and their own academic struggles, and being a facilitator allows me to be more attuned to what they're bringing to the experience, what else is going on in the building at the time, and how is that interrupting or facilitating learning in the classroom. So lots of secondary issues about high school learners can be addressed when you are in a blended scenario, because no one's expecting you just to be at the front of the classroom ready to go. I'm actually, my administrator came by one day and couldn't find me in the classroom and was certain that I was out, but I was actually sitting with students at a desk, and that was very cool. Actually, I didn't take that as criticism at all. That's exactly what I wanted to see.
Yeah, and it's funny you bring that up, because there seems to be a lot of use of out-of-classroom space in blended environments now. If you go to many of the blended schools, there's a lot of activity in the corridors. They're changing the corridors into kind of like workspace.
Right.
I mean, are you seeing that at your school? Is that a kind of trend?
Yes, we have just last summer installed restaurant booth seating in some of the corridors, and we have no longer have permanent tables. The tables can all be moved around, the chairs can be moved around, the booth seating is fastened to the walls, but allows for flexible workspaces, because more and more, and we've changed our library. We don't call it a library anymore. We don't have a librarian. It's a learning commons, and there are plenty of people in the building that can offer guidance into research skills. So we've taken many of the books out of the library, much to the chagrin of some teachers, but we have them archived. You can still access books, but we needed to open up more space and bring in natural lighting and make it possible for students to collaborate. And so that has changed, but yes, the flexibility of it, so it can suit a wide variety of needs of students. It's been pretty exciting to see the changes.
And when you observe those students collaborating in those different spaces, are those students collaborating, having been socially engineered into a collaboration by you, or have they decided on their own based on the interaction on the Google Docs and everything else to come to their own conclusions on how best to get to the learning that they need?
Well, they will sometimes select their favorite friends to work with. That's not always the most productive, and so the engineering of that did need guidance at the beginning. It's random draws to have opportunities to work with different people you might not necessarily choose to work with. I think that's very important. Also, a 21st century skill for the college place and the workplace. But over time, there's a comfort with working with a team and building camaraderie with the team. So I don't want to interrupt that too much. So although I don't want them to just be working with their BFFs, I did want to give them some flexibility over who they thought they could, you know, to build trust with, to build camaraderie with as they're learning as well.
Got it. So, Debbie, I think we have time for one, maybe two more questions. We're nearly at the 45-minute mark.
Okay.
Over the years, what changes did you make? What were the most important changes over the 3-year period or so that we've been talking about?
One of the changes I made was not to forget to have the self-assessment piece built into the activity, to have self-assessment and maybe not a formal rubric, but at least some standards for quality, to make sure that if we're not clear with the students on what's the quality standard for the product, until they are very comfortable with this format, they might present you with something less than you're expecting. So the quality standards, early on, I didn't always put those on there, and I found that did not lead to great results. So adding that. And then secondly, just trying to back away from it, realizing that it's not important that every single page of a textbook be read, that the textbook is just a resource, that there are many other versions of information that my students need to access. So just breaking away from having to make sure every tree is seen. I want you to see the forest, making sure that they can fit topics under a theme. That evolved for me, because in the first year I taught AP, I really was just certain that I needed to complete every single item that was presented in the opening pages of a textbook, and I got away from that, and it began to make more sense that the connections, the themes, being able to show change over time, those created far better essays, much more mastery of learning once they could do that, and then the details begin to fall into place. You don't have to have them all, you just need to have 3 or 4 pieces of evidence to support your point, and that's what we focused on.
Right. Well, you just brought up a question that's been really at the top of my mind, and maybe we can finish with this. Do you think that blending your classes, there's been a lot of talk about mastery and competency-based education. Do you think that blending your classes provides a much easier platform to move towards that, mastery and competency-based paradigms?
I do. I do. And, you know, as far as competency, you could easily marry standards-based assessment with this process. I think it partners very well with it, and it also prevents a lot of the competition because everyone is sort of moving in their own direction. Learning is taking place, and they're producing a product, but it doesn't have to be the identical product to the person sitting beside them. So I think it takes away some of that academic stress to be the top of the class or to be stronger than the peer. I think it individualizes. The possibility for individualizing the instruction is very great in this model. Great.
Debbie, you've been fantastic as usual. You know, I really appreciate you doing this. Hopefully you'll take some questions on the listserv as they appear. Thank you very much to everybody for participating, and we will see you at another Oasis XP broadcast.
You're welcome. Thank you.